Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal tension had never been thicker within the walls of the Port Charles Police Department than in the moment Anna made the shocking decision to strip both Dante and Chase of their badges and service weapons. The atmosphere, usually rigid and procedural, was suddenly suffocating with disbelief as officers, administrative staff, and detectives froze in stunned silence. No one could have anticipated that the two most respected and synchronized detectives in the department, once hailed as the gold standard of professional camaraderie and mutual trust, would find themselves on opposite sides of an invisible but brutal emotional chasm. For years, Dante and Chase had operated like a well-oiled machine, complementing each other's instincts, protecting one another on the streets, and standing shoulder to shoulder through some of Port Charles's darkest criminal cases. But that brotherhood was dismantled in mere days, undone not by a criminal's bullet, but by a buried secret from the past that erupted with destructive force. The revelation had come like a thunderclap. Brooke Lynn, Chase's devoted wife, had long harbored a secret too immense and too fragile to speak of. When she was a teenager, she had become pregnant with Dante's child. She had carried that child in silence and given it up for adoption, a decision made in the vulnerability and chaos of youth. But what haunted the situation wasn't just the pregnancy, it was the lie of omission that lasted for over 2 decades. Brooke Lynn had never told Dante he was a father. She had never allowed him the chance to know, to grieve, to decide, or even to search. And when Chase found out, caught between the weight of his love for Brooke Lynn and the moral duty he owed his partner, he made a choice that would fracture everything he thought he stood for. He kept the secret. In his mind, he was shielding the woman he loved from pain and protecting a history she had buried with immense difficulty. But to Dante, that silence was a betrayal so profound that it tore at the very fabric of their partnership. When Dante learned the truth, the rage he felt wasn't just about what had been hidden from him, it was about what had been stolen. A fatherhood he never knew, a past rewritten without his consent, a chance to be something more than a badge and a gun. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than any wound sustained on duty. And that wound demanded expression. In the midst of whispered gossip and incredulous stares from their colleagues, Dante confronted Chase right in the central hallway of the PCPD, the heart of the institution that once upheld their bond. The words exchanged were vicious, stripped of any professionalism or restraint, a brutal clash between emotional pain and moral outrage. But words weren't enough. The storm surged beyond the capacity for language. In a split second, Chase's fist flew with raw fury, crashing into Dante's face with the weight of all his shame, guilt, and heartbreak. Blood spurted from Dante's nose instantly, a vivid symbol of how far things had fallen. What began as a personal confrontation spiraled into an all-out physical brawl between two high-ranking officers. They didn't hold back. Years of friendship, loyalty, and suppressed emotion exploded in front of stunned onlookers. Desks were overturned, file folders flew into the air, and shouts of alarm echoed down the corridors. Anna, who had once mentored and trusted both men implicitly, arrived to the chaos with icy composure. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't issue threats. She simply looked at them, her expression devoid of warmth, and made her decision with ruthless efficiency. Both were to be arrested and held in one of the department's internal holding cells, stripped of their titles, stripped of their pride, and imprisoned not as cops, but as two men who had allowed personal demons to destroy the principles they once swore to uphold. The heavy clang of the cell door behind them sounded like a funeral bell for a friendship that had once seemed indestructible. Locked together in a narrow, dimly lit space, Chase and Dante were forced into an intimate proximity neither of them wanted. Gone were their badges, their guns, their titles. All that remained were the raw, bleeding wounds of two lives that had become painfully entangled. The air between them was thick with rage and unspoken grief, with the tremors of unhealed trauma and impossible questions. They sat at opposite ends of the cell, backs turned, the silence between them louder than any siren outside. There was no escape, not from the metal bars, and not from the truths that had finally surfaced after years of being buried under layers of loyalty, fear, and denial. Anna's decision had not been one of punishment, but of forced reckoning. She had watched too many relationships in this department corrode quietly beneath the surface until the rot became irreversible. This time, she intervened before the damage could spread further. She wanted them to face each other not as officers, but as men, as flawed human beings forced to own their choices and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way forward. Whether they would emerge with a renewed sense of understanding or let the bitterness calcify into permanent division remained to be seen. But for now, within that cold, confined space, Dante and Chase had no other option but to sit with their shame, their anger, and the possibility that the only path to redemption might start with learning how to forgive the unforgivable. Anna stood outside the holding cell, her posture stiff, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, and her eyes colder than the steel bars that now separated two of her most trusted detectives from the rest of the department. There was no trace of warmth or hesitation in her tone when she delivered the verdict. Dante and Chase were going nowhere until they could find a solution. She had given too much of herself to the PCPD, fought too long and too hard to uphold discipline, only to watch the integrity of her team unravel in a violent spectacle of fists and rage. Her disappointment was palpable, but her decision wasn't born of vengeance, it was born of necessity. Gone were the heated strategy meetings, the shared missions under cover of night, the whispered intelligence reports passed around the squad room. In their place stood a stark reality, two broken men, no longer functioning as officers or partners, locked in a confined space where neither could run from the truth, from the pain, or from each other. The hours that followed were drenched in suffocating silence. Neither Chase nor Dante dared to speak, as if words themselves had become too fragile, too dangerous to touch. They sat at opposite ends of the narrow holding cell, backs hunched, eyes cast downward, letting the weight of their own pride hang in the air like a noose. The tension was unbearable, an invisible force field created by years of friendship, trust, betrayal, and heartbreak. Each minute passed like an eternity, marked only by the soft hum of the faulty overhead light and the occasional clink of keys echoing down the corridor. Neither man wanted to be the first to lower his defenses, to admit fault, to risk further injury to an already wounded ego. The cell became a battlefield of silence, where the only weapons were memories and unspoken regrets. But as the afternoon light waned and slipped through the tiny barred window, casting long shadows across the cold concrete floor, something in the air shifted. Chase glanced up, not with the defiance of a man still defending his actions, but with the cautious gaze of someone beginning to see past his own pain. For the first time since the cell door had slammed shut, he looked at Dante not as a furious father deprived of truth, but as a man, flawed, wounded, abandoned by circumstance. There was sorrow in Chase's eyes, but also clarity. And Dante, whose rage had been as fierce as it was justified, finally allowed himself to meet that gaze. In Chase's expression, he saw no manipulation, no malice, no smugness, only the quiet despair of someone who had tried and failed to protect the only thing he thought he still had control over, his family. That night, as the last shift of guards moved down the hall and their footsteps slowly faded, Dante and Chase remained silent. But it was no longer the silence of war. It was the quiet of two men beginning to acknowledge each other's humanity again. The air between them no longer buzzed with fury, but with tentative acceptance, a fragile truce carved out by exhaustion and the inescapable presence of one another. It was the beginning of a new kind of communication, one that didn't need words yet, but relied on the mutual understanding that neither man had come out of this unscathed. Both were bleeding in their own way, and for the first time, neither tried to hide it. The next morning, when Anna returned to the holding cell, she instantly sensed the change. The fire was still there, but it had softened, redirected inward. The two men who had once erupted like volcanoes now sat in stillness, the kind of stillness that suggested introspection. They weren't snarling like wounded beasts anymore. They weren't glaring or posturing. They were simply there, side by side in silence, breathing the same stale air and, perhaps for the first time, breathing in unison. Anna didn't speak. She didn't have to. She closed the doors softly behind her, leaving them to what had already begun, the slow, painful rebuilding of a bond that once seemed unbreakable. Over the next several days, the walls of the cell bore witness to moments of raw confession and tentative vulnerability. Between the flickering of the overhead light and the dull ache of confinement, Chase finally found the words that had escaped him in the heat of conflict. He spoke quietly, haltingly, about the nights Brooke Lynn lay awake beside him, haunted by the secret she kept. About her silent tears and restless dreams. About how he had begged her to tell the truth, and how her fear of destroying everything they had built together had paralyzed her. He spoke of the weight he carried. Not only of his own guilt, but of hers too. He confessed to his own fear, to the crushing anxiety that if the truth surfaced, it would unravel the fragile life they had finally managed to construct. He hadn't wanted to be complicit, but he had also been too afraid to be the one to light the match. Dante listened, his shoulders tense but his jaw no longer clenched. With each word, each honest admission, the wall he had erected between them began to crack. Eventually, he opened up too. He shared the hollowness that had settled into his chest since learning the truth, the surreal realization that he had a child out there, someone who shared his blood and name, and yet was a complete stranger. He spoke of the fury he'd felt, not just at Brooke Lynn or Chase, but at the years lost, the moments he'd never get back. He described the ache of knowing that he had been denied the right to be a father, and the helplessness that came with realizing there was no way to rewind time. But he also admitted that he had seen something in Chase's eyes that night, a kind of grief that mirrored his own. In the dim light of that cell, with no uniforms, no shields, no titles to protect them, Chase and Dante began to rebuild, not through forgiveness, not yet, but through understanding. They didn't excuse each other's choices. They didn't pretend things could ever return to the way they were. But they accepted that the only way forward was together. That their partnership, their brotherhood, had been bruised and battered, but not beyond repair. What they found, in that cold, confined place, was not closure but a beginning. A fragile, imperfect beginning. A silent vow that the next time they faced the world beyond those bars, they would do so not as adversaries, but as men who had survived the worst of themselves, and chosen, against all odds, to rise again. When the message finally reached Anna, that Dante and Chase had voluntarily requested to return to active duty as partners, it wasn't accompanied by formal apologies or grand declarations. It was quiet, understated, almost tentative. But to her, it spoke volumes. It was a message laced not with resolution, but with willingness, and that made all the difference. She stood at her office window as the light from the city spilled across her desk, the silence wrapping around her like the final note in a long, unresolved symphony. Her gamble, one that could have easily backfired, had finally yielded its result. Not through disciplinary action, not through suspensions or official reprimands, but through forced reflection, isolation, and the brutal honesty that came when two people had nothing left to hide behind. Her strategy had not been about punishment, but about pause. About slowing down two lives crashing at full speed toward irreparable ruin and giving them a space where they had no choice but to face the truth, both within themselves and in each other. It wasn't redemption she had been hoping for. That would be too neat, too easy. What she wanted was something messier, more real. Growth. Reckoning. Humility. And that was exactly what had happened between those cold, iron bars in that dimly lit holding cell. She had known that Dante and Chase weren't lost causes. She had seen the goodness in them too many times to give up on it now. But she had also seen how grief, betrayal, pride, and unspoken wounds could rot even the most solid foundations from the inside out. And so, when they emerged with tear-streaked eyes and exhausted faces, carrying the weight of conversations that no badge could ever prepare them for, she didn't need to hear their words to know that something fundamental had shifted. Port Charles had seen its fair share of tragedies. It had borne witness to crimes that shattered families, conspiracies that twisted friendships into vendettas, and betrayals that destroyed love in a single breath. But in the quiet aftermath of this particular storm, something rare unfolded, not in courtrooms or operating rooms, but in a jail cell meant to punish, that had instead transformed into a crucible for rediscovery. Two men, both stripped of their identities as protectors of the law, had found within their vulnerability the remnants of something worth rebuilding. Not just their partnership, but their trust in one another as human beings. And it hadn't come easy. It had come with bruises, with silence, with the devastating acknowledgement that forgiveness often begins not with a soft word, but with a fist driven by pain. When Chase and Dante returned to Anna's office, no longer dressed in civilian clothes but once again donning the uniform that represented their duty, they did not ask for praise. They asked for a second chance to do what they had once done so effortlessly, protect and serve. But now, they would do it with eyes unclouded by illusion, with a deeper understanding of each other's limits, loyalties, and losses. Anna looked at them not as two men who had disappointed her, but as two survivors of their own storm. She handed back their badges not with ceremony, but with quiet confidence. Because the real punishment had never been the cell, it had been the reckoning that happened inside it. And the reward was the chance to rise again. What had transpired between Chase and Dante in that confined space would never be shared in its entirety. There would be no report filed, no official statement recorded. It was too personal, too sacred in its own way. But those who knew them, those who had seen the explosion of violence and confusion that led to their imprisonment, would see the difference in their eyes, in the way they walked beside each other without the edge of competition, in the way their silence no longer screamed distance but comfort. They would see it in the way they moved through crime scenes, covering each other's backs not because the rulebook demanded it, but because something unspoken and unbreakable had been reforged. Perhaps what was most remarkable about their return wasn't their reinstatement or the return of their badges, but the invisible armor they now wore, the armor of having faced the ugliest parts of their past and survived. Few people ever get the chance to confront that darkness and come out of it whole. Even fewer do it while sitting across from the very person they blamed for their pain. But Chase and Dante had done just that. Not perfectly. Not cleanly. But honestly. They had learned that sometimes, the path to forgiveness is paved with shattered pride and raw truth. That sometimes, a single punch thrown in rage can start a conversation more honest than 1,000 carefully chosen words. And so, the next time they stepped onto the streets of Port Charles with their badges secured over their hearts, they did so not merely as officers resuming their shifts, but as men who had crossed through fire and found each other on the other side. Their partnership was no longer defined by protocol or procedure, but by the blood, sweat, and soul they had spilled in that cell. It was no longer about being the best team in the department. It was about being human, being fallible, and still choosing to stand together. Because in the end, forgiveness isn't granted, it's earned. And sometimes, it begins not with an apology, but with a breakdown. With pain. With confrontation. And with the courage to stay in the room until the silence no longer hurts. For Dante and Chase, that moment came behind locked doors. And when they walked back through them, they didn't leave as the same men who had entered. They walked out as something stronger. Something truer. And that made all the difference.